Hello and a very warm welcome to the second part of our series, An Introduction into History of Art. The focus of the second part is going to be on different subject and genre. This goes back to a concept which is called the hierarchy of genre. What does the hierarchy of genre mean? Until the 18th century, there were primarily paintings and sculptures which were focused on history paintings, on mythologies and religious subject matter. And many artists before the Renaissance were mainly considered as craftsmen. And already during the Renaissance, particularly due to the patronage of the Medici family, there was a concept of elevating the status of the artists considered as craftsmen to actually a much higher status, and which is exemplified in artists such as Michelangelo or Leonardo or Raphael. In the course of this period, therefore, complex images, paintings, as we have studied already in part one on mythological subject matter, religious subject matter, and I gradually will introduce you to historical subject matter, had a much higher ranking. In the 18th century, there was a new development and the establishments of Academies of Art. And you may be aware of them. There's the Academy of Art, the Royal Academy in London, there's the Academy in Paris, we have an Academy in Vienna, and so forth. So that was really a development out of the Enlightenment to create these kind of academies to give a kind of proper schooling and a proper standing in society of the artists. However, it was rather conservative in many ways. That's why we have then in the 19th and the 20th century a lot of artists who were rebelling against this kind of confinements given to them. But the kind of status of the artist is important to see. Now, part of this development of the academies was also that they created a hierarchy of genre, so that there's certain types, subject matter, were considered as more important than others due to their complexity. Not only the complexity actually of creating a narrative, but also complexity in the sense of what the knowledge of the artist needs to be on, let's say, the biblical knowledge, the philosophical knowledge, the historical knowledge, and how this is transferred onto painting. So therefore, we have really at the very top of the hierarchy of genres something called narrative paintings, which includes mythology, religion, history. And with historical paintings, it can be on ancient subject matter or contemporary subject matter. Then one has portraiture. Then comes genre painting. Genre painting, this is, please do not confuse the hierarchy of genre with genre painting. Genre painting as such means scenes of everyday life, which could be a woman cooking, maybe, someone fetching a bucket of water. And then underneath the genre painting come landscape, and at the very bottom are still lifes. Now, with the time, we will come across works of art where obviously different genres are included in the same work. But I think it is really important to follow this kind of almost development of what is considered as the most important according to the academies, not on a personal kind of judgment, because it gives us a kind of structure. We look at subject matter which obviously fall into one or the other genre. For example, the depiction of the nude, which can be in a mythological painting, which can be in a completely different context as well. And we are going to look at paintings as well as at sculpture. So I would like to take you now on a journey, and please, if we start with the first example. So my aim for today's lesson is that I start with mythological examples, with a few paintings, and again, like in our previous first part, I will try to follow a chronology, and after that we look after some examples of paintings, we look at one or the other example with sculpture, and then we move to religious examples. Good. Another thing which I would like to, as a kind of introductory thing, mention to you, we are going, when we start looking at examples such as Raphael's Galatea, we are going to review a little bit the formal aspects which we have done previously, composition, three-dimensional depth, color, maybe the medium. I will also refer to the style, but we expand on that. So it's more also where we start including, and I'm touching on patronage, maybe the location, the interpretation. So it is, I would say, much more a kind of more universal approach to looking from different sides. So when we look at Raphael's Galatea, it is a fresco painting, which you might recall when we started looking at it in part 1, and it is in the Villa Farnesina. The Villa Farnesina was commissioned as a building by Chigi, who was a Sienese banker who lived in the early 16th century and who was actually a banker to the papacy. So consequently, he had a very important status and he was very wealthy. And for those who have been to Rome, it is on the other side of the Arno, not of the Arno, sorry, of the Tiber. And you have more or less, it would have been a villa suburbinata in our today's context, a suburban villa. But villa is actually really a small palace, and if you have not been there and you have an opportunity one day to go to Rome, I really, really recommend to visit this gem. It's just a beautiful location. The building is stunning. You have fresco paintings by Raphael on 2 floors, all have a different theme. And it's a stunning small garden, very intimate. And when you can't go to in the right time of the year, I mean, you have orange trees blossoming. Like I said, it is a gem, and it is also in an area where normally, I would say maybe at the beginning of the 20th century, so the working class would have been living. So you have this contrast. So it's a very kind of Roman area. And whether you have then also these exclusive villas. Now, there's a room on the ground floor which is called the Room of Galatea, and this is just one painting in the room. And one really needs to understand the painting a little bit in the context of the room. Also, I'm not showing you a painting, otherwise we could spend a whole day on that. Now, Galatea, she's a sea nymph. And she had a lover called Acis, but a Cyclope called Polyphemus fell in love with her, and he killed Acis, and then he was in a pursuit of Galatea. And the reason why I'm telling you that, because we have no reference to Acis, and in the room where you would have the fresco, there would be a door, and above the door would be a fresco of Polyphemus, and he's looking down to her because he's hunting, he's in a pursuit of her, and this is when she's looking up towards him. So she tries to escape this pursuit. Now you remember probably from the previous part that we had a look at Raphael's School of Athens, and with all this calm and composure, and in a certain way there is so much more dynamic here. One can see also the development of the artist coming through. He has been in contact with the work of Michelangelo, who worked on assisting ceiling. He is getting more confident in his interpretation of subject matter. It is also not such an official commission, like it would have been with the School of Athens for the Pope. It's in a much more private context. It is a narrative which is going throughout the whole room, so there seems to be so much more confidence and maybe daring, audacity of him, and maybe also freedom, a kind of joy coming through. So we have here Galatea being in this contrapposto pose, turning up towards Polyphemus, trying to escape. There's a kind of, they're dolphins which are drawing this kind of boat, which is a shell, and they try to help escaping her. Around is all the theme of love. So you have nymphs and all the different kind of mythological creatures in a certain way who underline the theme of love. Then you have the cupids here, and this is quite important in view of composition. Think about it. Galatea is in the central vertical axis. Above the head is the central horizontal axis. So it's really clear organization. Then, even if there's quite a lot of dynamic, but you have quite a nice grouping. Again, you have 1, 2, 3 figures. You have 1, 2, 3 figures. 1, 2, 3, and then you have this one cupid up on the left-hand top corner, and the other one here. This one is looking down. This one is looking up. So you have actually a strong diagonal, and here the eyes are parallel to her eyes. Then the arrows point to the vanishing point, which is just her face. And the way the cupids here are floating in the air, if we start here, it is like a figure of 8 going through the whole picture. You may remember from last part when we had a look at Raphael's Transfiguration. It was a very, very similar kind of composition, and also much lighter in the top part than in the bottom part. Very important also is that sometimes I'm going to refer to text sources. So here, actually, Raphael referred to several text sources. He referred to Ovid, to Catullus, and to Aelian. Aelian, he wrote a book, and he was an ancient Roman writer, and he wrote a book on animals in which dolphins appear, and that's why we have the dolphins there. So what I would like to say, when coming back to my introduction on the hierarchy of genre, one thing is an artist is a craftsman, talented with the tools of his trade. But it goes so much more complex. Even if, for example, Raphael may have had some guidance in interpreting the subject matter, but the texts would have been either in Latin or Greek. It would have supposed to have that he has an education to be able, A, to read it, or to understand interpretations, to be able to discuss it, and then to transfer the narrative of a text. Not only in this picture here, but in the context of the whole room in a narrative. So this is why I want to explain to you how important this kind of switch from being a mere craftsman is to become actually really a high regarded artist. And the status is really important because, coming back to who commissioned that, it was Chigi, who was a banker from Siena, who was the banker for the papacy. It was at a time when Raphael also worked for the Pope. So in a certain way, the banker was in competition with the Pope. And they were both trying to get Raphael working for them. So it elevates also the status of the patron, which kind of artist is in favor to work for them. So it's a very, very big shift. So we can move now to the next example. This is one of the paintings you know already. So I will focus this time on a very different part. It was commissioned by Este, the Duke of Ferrara. And again, it was a painting which was part of a series of paintings, this time not connected with each other, but for his private palace. And it was for the Room of Alabaster. And this is another aspect which I would like to introduce here on this occasion. Apart from commissioning a very famous artist, which is reflecting on the status of the patron, the Room of Alabaster in the Ducal Palace would have been a reception room where the Duke would have entertained guests. So guests would come into this room and, for instance, like see this particular painting. You have to see these things in the context of the time when they were made. There was no cinema, there were no diversions which we have in our contemporary modern life. So for them, it was really something which was a conversation piece. It prompted conversation, and it actually expected from the audience, from the guests, to understand the narrative and to be able to discuss this and to exchange, which again reflected then on the status of the patron, because it showed not only his wealth and its importance, but also that he himself is very educated. Now, like the previous painting, this one is a High Renaissance painting. The difference between the previous painting and this one, although it is almost in a very similar time, so 8 years apart, is that the first one was the Renaissance in Rome and the second one the Renaissance in Venice. The Renaissance in Rome always focused on a formal aspect called disegno, which was a focus on line. You may recall the arrows, the figure of 8, the diagonals. So, and in some ways, apart from one or the other color, the colors are actually not as important. Here, with the Renaissance in Venice, colors are more important than line, which is called colorito. So the school in Rome, disegno, and the school in Venice, colorito. Why Venice? There are several reasons for that. Venice used to be a really important port from where actually ships which brought goods from across the Mediterranean into Venice, and from Venice it then dispersed into different parts of Europe. Also, a lot of the goods which were then shipped across the Mediterranean to Venice came from the Silk Road. And as you may remember, we were highlighting the amount of blue in this painting the last time, the Lapis Lazuli blue. The Lapis Lazuli is a stone from modern Afghanistan. So you can see again this kind of journey which were made. A lot of pigments were brought to Venice, and then artists from all over different parts of Italy or Europe came often to Venice in order to choose the pigments because it had the highest quality. So that's why for local artists, color was more important than line, and they had easier access to it. Good. So coming back now more on the subject and genre aspect. So it's a mythological painting. Again, it referred to extracts from Ovid. It also referred to Poliziano, who was more a kind of Renaissance writer. And I just quickly take you again through the narrative. So we have here Ariadne. She's the one who rescued Theseus from the labyrinth. And they went together on an island called Naxos. But Theseus wanted to go on new adventures, and he left Ariadne behind. And we can see Theseus' ship here. While she was mourning his departure, she was really disturbed by a conundrum and lots of noise. And when she turned, she just saw Bacchus, the god of wine, coming out of the forest, in a certain sense of also out of the darkness, with the Bacchante, So basically they had a huge feast, quite excessive, out of the forest, and he's just about to jump from his chariot, and in that moment their eyes connect. And she's still in this transition between mourning the departing Theseus and more or less looking in the eyes of her future husband. And this is when this kind of famous kind of connection is with the eyes, which is reiterated here in the cheetahs. Now, things which I would like to show you this time around and focus. So I go now away from the more formal aspects. The figures are actually, some of the figures refer to sculptures from antiquity. Do not forget, it's a Renaissance painting. Renaissance, revival of classical antiquity. So not only the text sources or reference to mythology, but also to antique sculpture. So for instance, this sculpture of one of the Bacchante fighting with the snakes is a direct reference to a Hellenistic sculpture called the Laocoon, which was unearthed about 10 years previously in Rome. Michelangelo apparently was there when the sculpture was found, and it had a huge influence on a really huge, big range of artists. The way Bacchus is depicted here with the contrapposto refers to classical sculpture of Apollo, so which means that Titian was aware of classical and Hellenistic sculpture, which he must have been able to study firsthand, and which he more or less transferred onto the canvas and reinterpreted them in the context of the narrative. Then there are more private things coming through. The Duke of Ferrara had a menagerie. You can imagine a menagerie with exotic animals at the beginning of the 16th century. You can imagine the wealth he had, and apparently in this menagerie there were cheetahs. Because if you would follow the texts, that the chariots of Bacchus is always drawn by panthers. But more or less this was then where Titian did a very kind of free interpretation. It might have been him, or maybe the Duke wanted it, and he replaced it with cheetahs. Which means that people, guests who would come, would be able to really understand all these kind of references. Also, when you are reading the extract of Ovid, and you can read it in the Latin, you will see that there is almost, it's audible, the text, the way the poem is written. And this kind of audible thing comes through in the way Titian has interpreted how the people, how more or less the Bacchante come out of the forest. Then there are other little things. It was extremely important for dukes, for example, but also for the papacy, in order to keep high status, to collect. It could have been sculptures, it could have been manuscripts, but everything related to antiquity, and also objects. So here you have a vase, which has actually also in Latin an inscription that Titian has made this vase. So it's an antique vase, but Titian actually signed there as well. So which means he was very much aware of his proper status as an artist. Then in the narrative, he would not have had a spaniel. So this probably was a pet animal of the Duke. So something, a mythological painting with all the aspects which I told you in the text sources, has a very contemporary reading. Good, let us move to the next example. Here I would like to show you now the difference between the disegno and the colorito, and I think you may be able to see really the different approaches. Again, the lines, the figure of 8, the fairly subdued color, yes, the red is here, and then here the strong colors, also the dark and the light. There's something coming through here which is philosophical concept, which goes back to actually Nietzsche's writing, where he differentiated between ethos and pathos. And pathos would be more about debauchery, about feelings, about expression, and ethos would be more purity, more reservation. And this is reiterated here through color. So you have here the strong diagonal, and you have the pathos with the feeling, the debauchery on the darker side, and then the heavenly side here. And you may actually recall what I told you the last time with this constellation of stars, because as Ariadne was a mere mortal, and when Bacchus married her, there are several interpretations, but one of them is that he took her crown because she was a princess and threw it up into the air, which then became this constellation of stars to make her eternal. But there are other interpretations as well. One of the things is also quite interesting. So this kind of idea where you have, which is in both paintings, is where the color comes in very briefly with the red. Red is passion. And obviously, because it's a theme of love, which is pursued in both paintings, you have here the drapery, the red drapery, you have here a little bit of drapery, you have here red, and so it's, and then here just a tiny little bit, so different shadings, but it's reiterated throughout the whole, in both cases. So in both cases you have, it is the theme of love. You have two different schools of painting. This is a much clearer organization where it's almost a textbook Renaissance painting. Symmetry, balance, harmony and proportion. And here you have a much freer interpretation. Now, I'll do a little bit of jump now. I leave a certain period out because I just thought I'd focus more on 19th century art. And I need to give you a little bit an introduction to that. As you can see, it's again very classical in its approach. And to that, it is important to give you a little bit more context. In the mid to second half of the 18th century, there was something really important. There were the archaeological finds of Pompeii and Herculaneum in modern-day Italy. And through this kind of excavation, there was a revival interest in antiquity. And there was a German writer called Winkelmann who wrote absolutely passionately about the importance of these excavations and that they should set a kind of example to us. And he studied the works, and through his writings it influenced artists to revive again classical subject matter, and not only that, but to actually really use them as what you call exemplum virtutis, so actually virtuous, morally inspiring examples. And that is why many artists went back to classical subject matter. So what do we have here? We have Oedipus and the Sphinx. There was a prophecy when Oedipus was born that one day he's going to kill his father. And because of that, when he was a small child, he was sent off from Thebes. And he had no idea about actually his heritage, and he was wanting to go to Thebes, which we see here very much in the distance here. But because of the prophecy, the king made sure that at the entrance, before one can gets access to Thebes, a sphinx is there who only allows people to pass if they solve the riddle. And otherwise, she would actually kill them. And Oedipus is facing her. I'll come back to the painting. I just want to give you a little bit of story now. the kind of riddle is, what has 4 legs in the morning, 2 at midday, and 3 in the evening? And Oedipus rightly found out it is man with these different stages: a crawling baby, an upright man, and then in the older age with a walking stick. So, but this was before he solved the riddle, but one needs to see this in a whole context. So he's facing the Sphinx. Here you see actually dead body, skulls, bones, a friend of Oedipus running away. And it's quite interesting, actually, the formal aspect of the composition. Central vertical axis, central horizontal axis. We have, again, very interesting how things are with lines. So, for example, look at this here, how this starts. Here, this curve. Then there are different geometrical elements coming through. So we have a round aspect, we have here a rectangular aspect, we have here triangle, inverted triangles, where the geometry plays quite significantly with it. The study of Ingres, of classical sculpture, the focus on musculature, on idealization. So it's more or less, again, this concept of ethos against pathos. Morally inspiring example, facing challenges, keeping calm, and like I said, so this is more or less then how the narrative would continue. So he would be able to have access, and what happens then eventually, the prophecy really is realizing he's killing his father, unknowingly that it is, and marries his mother. Which is famously, obviously, explained also in plays, in classical plays. Good. Huge jump. So from this very kind of neoclassical approach of Ingres, really focusing on Winckelmann, we have here a very, very different mythological approach. This is about Satan, and Satan is amongst other kind of symbolism, also the god of time. And it's an absolutely harrowing painting. I mean, it's very large, actually, when you look at it. Also, we have no kind of reference in the background, just a dark background. It belongs to one of the dark paintings of Goya. Absolutely mad, nothing idealized about it. Look at these angular things. Every time I look at it, and also the hands, I have to think of Schiele's work with this kind of angularity and bone. Here, in this madness, Satan is devouring one of his sons, and he's just about to bite another piece, another arm of it. You just think, what it is about, why is he doing that? But we need to see it in the context of the time. I will give you a little bit an introduction now, and I will reiterate it when we have a look at other works in this and in the next lesson. One needs to see this in the context of the Peninsula Wars. So what were the Peninsula Wars? Napoleon Bonaparte, when he was emperor, he was very eager to expand the predominance of France and to expand his empire. And it is famously towards the east when he tried to go so far as Moscow, which in one is, for example, wonderfully depicted the campaign in Tolstoy's War and Peace. But at the same time, he also expanded westwards and to Spain. And the only thing is, which was a problem for Napoleon and for the army of Napoleon, was because they had more or less simultaneously the expansion towards the east and the expansion towards the west, that it was really difficult controlling uprisings. So here in that case, the Spanish, you may remember Goya's 3rd of May, we had a look during the part 1, you had uprisings from the local population. called the guerrilleros, hence guerrilla fighters, this expression. And in order to show defiance towards the French invaders, so the Spaniards, actually, a lot of people had to fight. So one of the things we can actually maybe understand more now, the context of the painting, is more or less how much war is devouring its own citizens, how a country devours its own citizens. So basically, Spain is feeding its citizens to war, and the madness of it all, of the context. So it's a very powerful symbolic painting, so it has nothing to do in a deep sense, or maybe a kind of mythological interpretation. It's a political statement and a pacifist statement. Again, here I just wanted to show you this as a kind of contrast, and it's not such a long time apart. French artists, Spanish artists, it's also not geographically that they are that extremely apart. But this is where Winkelmann's principle of a kind of morally inspiring example is, exemplum virtutis, the clear organization, the absolute sculptural treatment of the human form, how important line is, ethos, being reserved, not showing emotions. And then here, Romanticism coming through. Neoclassicism, Romanticism. Romanticism really is going against this kind of almost Apollonian veil one is putting on hardship, and really is expressive of death, of hardship, of feelings, and it makes us uncomfortable to see how the clear organization is, how Oedipus is framed. Here you have the feeling the figure is absolutely squashed within the frame. So we have a look at also some sculptural example. Is an example we had a look previously, but just to reiterate it, as you may recall, with bronze sculpture you do a clay model or a wax model beforehand, and you can do different parts of it, and then there's the bronze casting, and then you can assemble all these things together. Because of the tensile strength, you would be able to create this kind of composition which would otherwise in marble or another stone not be able to be done. Because, as you may recall, you need a much more pyramidal structure when you have a marble piece. Also, there are various versions, and when the museums are accessible, you might actually want to have a look in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, but there's a much smaller version of an example of Giambologna's Mercury. But this one, and that's why I have written here the fourth version, was in the Medici Palace. They had a courtyard, and in the center of the courtyard was a fountain, and this was the centerpiece of the fountain. So for me, it has so much more importance, because when you just think that on that level you would have had the water and with the ripples and the light playing, how the effects would have been also with the play of light on the sculpture. It's a sculpture you conceive in the round. It's a mannerist sculpture, so you have the sense of elongation. Often male figures are effeminated, so made more female. You have elongations here, for example, with the finger. It's much more elegant, more refined, and the pose, it's what you call, is almost balearic. It's called an arabesque pose, and you can identify Mercury by the caduceus and by the winged helmet. And here, this is the head of Sapphire. It is the god of the west wind. Now, also very important, again, I told you with the Medici were commissioning it, this sculpture. So imagine the context. So people would come and would walk in the courtyard, would have a promenade. So again, it is really something to have such a kind of refined artist as Gian Bologna, and he originally came from France and then worked primarily also for the Medici. It would be again a conversation piece. Then this kind of mutuality between the Medici elevates the status of the artist, of the sculptor, but the sculptor is working for the Medici, is elevating the status of the patron. So it's kind of mutuality. Then the word Medici, medicus, so you have the kind of medicinal point, and then here through the snake, and do not forget that this is a symbol for pharmacies often, so there is a kind of direct connection. Then how did the Medici make money? It was through trade. And how do you trade? So it's important to deliver goods swiftly. Mercury is the messenger of the gods. He is someone who is delivering messages swiftly. So there's no, it could have been another sculpture, but no, the choice of subject matter of Mercury is directly related to the Medici as patrons. Benini. That's again a lovely, lovely story, and I do not know if you had an opportunity to go to the Villa Borghese in Rome. It's again so one of the gems where I would say make the most of it if you can go there. Again, the beautiful gardens around it, but the way Benini sculptures are displayed in there and the way the light falls on them, yeah, you can spend days there. Now, Benini was a Baroque artist. You may remember the Ecstasy of Santa Teresa, which we had a look in a church. This was commissioned by the Cardinal, who had a very, very, very kind of really important role. And Benini did several works for him, and this one is one where you really have to walk around it. It has a little bit a kind of narrative which is before what we actually see. Apollo had a kind of game, a competition with Cupid or Eros, and a little bit like boys competing with each other. And what Cupid stroke Eros did, he used one of his golden arrows and aimed it at Apollo, which meant that he fell in love with Daphne, and Eros stroke Cupid pointed a lead arrow at Daphne in the sense of that she will actually not respond to love. So here we have an absolutely mad in love Apollo pursuing the innocent Daphne, who tries to escape him and does not want to return the love. So she appeals to her father, a river god, who then turns her into a tree, a laurel tree. And the whole the whole sculpture is more or less a kind of this metamorphosis, this transformation of her gradually turning into a tree. So we start seeing, for example, here out of her fingers, you see the sprouting of small branches and leaves out of the hair. Gradually how her body changes into the bark-like structure. And the other thing is also that depending on which angle you're walking around it, you just see also, you do not see, for example, her expression yet, but you just see how he pursues her. And then in another angle, you just see the different expressions. So it's really something. It's almost like the narrative unfolds when you start walking around it. Another thing which is, I find important, was that she changes originally, into a tree, and Apollo then says, more or less, because he's a god, if I can't have her as a human or as a kind of person, if I only can have her as a tree, I then change her into a laurel tree, because then she will be eternal for me. And that's why he then used the laurel branches as a crown. And this is how we often can identify Apollo. And because Apollo is the god of poetry as well, because he's speaking, for example, about a poet laureate, yeah. So you have the symbol of the laurel crown, and just a small anecdote for me was something very special when I once was in Venice to observe that. A young man, he must have just graduated from university, and you have to imagine a huge, so an Italian family with, I do not know, all generations from old to young, 30, 40, 50 people, and this long table outside a restaurant on a square, and they were celebrating that he graduated, and he wore a laurel crown. So that's why it's some ways how symbolism is transferring. Good. Let's have a look at the next example. Now we do a journey to religious art. I do not want to spend now time on the properties of bronze, but I want to introduce you to two examples of how to interpret David. So we have Donatello, which would be an early Renaissance example, and later on we have a look at Michelangelo's interpretation. Very interesting. Look at the size. Yeah, so it's for a kind of pubescent boy. It's probably an average size, or maybe slightly small, or depending on. Very effeminate. He's in this contrapposto pose. Actually quite cocky a little bit. He has a helmet, and he has some sandals here, boots. Now, in some ways, these two aspects even enhance further his nudity. Then considering the way how there's no strong musculature. So one really just thinks about, he's the one who slayed Goliath, and he's more or less standing on the head of Goliath here at the very bottom. So it's a very, very famous sculpture. As such, you have here also the stone which he was addressing him, and obviously the sword with which he decapitated. But it's this pubescent boy after the battle, just feeling really quite good of himself. And now, very different example, if we have a look at Michelangelo's. Now, the original is now in Accademia. A copy you have outside the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. And I will go a little bit through the sculpture first, and then I will just explain you in a context where, if the original would be still standing outside, but it doesn't matter. I will explain this to you in a moment. Extremely high. I mean, just look. It's almost 3 times the height of our Donatello's version. The other thing is also that while Donatello is focusing after the battle, Michelangelo is focusing before the battle. And I introduced the expression of ethos to you. This is this kind of noblesse, this kind of inner resolution, upright, something honorable, showing no emotions. And David is incorporating all these things. But it's not a pubescent boy. It is a really young man in his prime with all the kind of physical strength. You may absolutely rightly say, actually, his hands look very large and his head looks very large. This has a kind of explanation. The figure originally was supposed to be standing high up on the north transept of the Cathedral of Florence. So in order to be able to see the sculpture from really down below, in the right proportion, certain elements needed to be enlarged so that physically, when we look up, it looks all right. But obviously, from the moment you put the sculpture further down, it looks out of proportion. On the other hand, one can see, and this is where the status of the artist comes through, the study of Michelangelo of the human anatomy is extraordinary. It's not just his skill as a kind of sculptor and carving these things, but the understanding of it. I mean, just look at this kind of veins. The sculpture, for me, I come back again to, because I like ballet so much. Yeah, when you study sometimes ballet dancers in certain positions and you can really see all these veins and the muscles, just absolutely superb. He shows no emotions whatsoever. He looks towards the enemy, towards Goliath. Absolutely reserved. Also, he has a very passive hand and a much more active hand, because this is where he is having this link in which he is going to subdue his enemy. Just very briefly, here you have the pyramidal composition with the support. It needs to have the tree stump as a support, because otherwise, because of the tensile strength, the sculpture would be very brittle. Now, the other thing is very important now. Also, where is the sculpture standing? So, obviously, we have the original now in the Galleria, and we have a copy outside the Palazzo Vecchio. The Palazzo Vecchio is the seat of the Florentine government. Still now, but in the context of the time, it was the seat of the Republican government. And there was for a short period of time a Florentine Republic following the expulsions of the Medicis, who became actually tyrants out of Florence. And what more or less the figure of David is representing, Michelangelo's version, is that he is an expression of republican virtues. And as such, imagine now the sculpture standing in front of the governmental building. It's almost like David is protecting the republican virtues, is protecting the citizens of Florence. And where he's looking to is the distance, and the gaze is towards Rome, where the Medici retired to for this period of time. So it's again, we have here a religious sculpture in a political context. So if we have a look now at the next one. So very briefly again, you can see the difference of interpretation before the battle, after the battle, different material, different sizes, different interpretation of the male body. Also, this would have been more in the Medici gardens, actually, because of the sculptural thing. So it's a very well chosen topic. Very famous painting. I mean, Raphael did lots and lots and lots of Madonna paintings. I would like, before I go into the depths here, I would like to give you a little bit a kind of understanding why Madonna paintings are so important. In the Old Testament, Eve caused the expulsion out of paradise. So Eve was quite a negative figure, female figure. And there was this need to almost counterbalance this negative Old Testament figure of Eve with a very positive female figure in the New Testament. That is one aspect. Then what incites us to prayer? Maybe something where we do not have some lofty figures whom we can't really have any relationship, but maybe we can be incited to prayer much more if there is a kind of more human form of it. So there are often depictions of the Madonna in very different connections. So we can have her, and I throw a few expressions to you now, as a Mater Amabilis, as a loving mother. So there she would be depicted a little bit like here with the Christ child. Yeah, we could have her as a Mater Dolorosa, which would be when she's grieving for the dead body. You may recall the Pietà we had a look the last time. We can have the Madonna of Humilities, which means when she's often bare feet, because she shows something very approachable there, or also when she's seated on the ground, because again she's more earthen, she's more on our level. Yet on the other hand, she could be, because she's floating up in heaven, she couldn't be the mother, more or less, or the queen of heaven. And then sometimes also in a context with others. So if, for example, you have come across an expression called Sacra Conversazione, is if you have the Madonna and the Christ child together with other saints, or with the Sacra Familia in connection with her, with Joseph, so as the Holy Family. Then another thing is also important before I come to this particular example. Often religious works were commissioned as a donor painting. You may recall Masaccio's Holy Trinity. This was a donor painting. And a donor painting was often in order to maybe celebrate an event or to donate money to a church in form of a work of art. But when it comes to celebrating an event, it could have been, for example, for a military victory, and it would be maybe because a particular city showed allegiance, and then one is donating a work of art to the church within a city. And this is where I come now to this work. So it was commissioned by Julius II, and he had a kind of ancestor called Saint Sixtus, who was also a pope in many, many years before Julius II became pope. This was commissioned as a votive example for the church of Saint Sixtus in Piacenza. Piacenza was a town who showed allegiance to the papal state in conflicts. And because of a victory over a battle, Pope Julius II wanted to show his gratefulness and then commissioned the work so that it was displayed in the church in Piacenza. It's again a very classical high Renaissance painting, but there's a lot still to discover. So it's quite interesting, the curtains being opened. It's very stage-like effect, theatrical effect. You have the Virgin and the Christ child descending from heaven. There's the Madonna of Humilities coming through with the bare feet. There's the Queen of Heaven, because she is floating on the clouds. Also, the blue garment, remember the Lapis Lazuli blue, but the blue garment is also the celestial aspect of her. The red, obviously, because of the Passion of Christ. The white, because of her purity as a virgin. Now, what is so extraordinary in this example is the way she and the Christ child are depicted. She was, by the way, a famous, Raphael had a famous model whom he used for various paintings, but it is not this idealized, completely detached figure of a virgin. It is a young mother who holds her newborn child. And the way the Christ behaves here, the Christ child behaves here, you may have come across when you may see maybe a friend holding a baby and you just want to come closer, oh, hello, and what does the child do? Retreats. I do not know you, and really seeks actually the maternal or the parental warmth because it gives them confidence. Now, you could think they would have a joyous expression. No, they don't. And one of the many theories is that in the original setting of that painting, on the other side of the wall in the church would have been a crucifixion. So the idea would be, or the interpretation would be, that descending from heaven, the mother holds joyously her newborn child with all the pride a young mother would feel. And what do they both see? At the other end, the doom, what is awaiting them. And the absolutely shock of the mother, and the child does not understand it. I mean, but how can a child understand that? So that is something really important to see. Then we have here Saint Sixtus, so more or less the ancestor of Pope Julius II. However, because Pope Julius II commissioned that work, Saint Sixtus has the features of Pope Julius II, so it's almost like a portrait of him, so that everyone knows that Julius II actually has commissioned a painting. So it's a little bit so propaganda, religious propaganda. So then we have the reference to tiara here. If you have a look then later on, maybe closer to the outfit, you will see that there are acorns, and the acorns are the symbol of the Della Rovere family, which is the family, the dynastic family, or the aristocratic family of Julius II. On this side is St. Barbara. We can see her because she has a kind of attribute, very brief, only a little bit one sees of a tower. Because the thing was, she was a beauty before she converted to Christianity, and her father wanted to protect her, so he actually put her in a tower that she does not see any pursuers. And while she was there by herself, she prayed, and she's gradually converted to Christianity. But she is a symbol, as a patron, because many saints are patrons for aspects of soldiers. What was the occasion of the commission of that painting? It was because Julius II wanted to say thank you to the city of Piacenza for showing allegiance to the Pope in the war against other city-states. Julius II is often called the warrior Pope because he wanted to expand the Vatican states, and as such he wanted almost to have other city-states to be part of his gradually growing empire. I do not know if any one of you might recall, it was somewhere in the 80s, at a kind of company called Fiorucci. And they used actually these putti as a kind of logo for their company. Here in the background, very eerie, you see more or less faces which are very, very ghost-like, which would be like angels in heaven. Maybe one more thing I would like to say also compositional wise. So central vertical axis, central horizontal axis, and this is where Raphael was absolutely gifted in how the figures relate with each other. And there is a certain parallel with the Galatea he has done beforehand. Foreshortened hand pointing to us, the viewer. If we look here, then it goes here. From here, it goes here. He is looking here. Then we have also the angels looking up, and then she looking down. So we have, it's almost like this kind of diamond shape thing, composition, and how the figures are interacting in the composition, that we are literally guided across, and how the colors are picked up as well, guiding us. You might recall when I mentioned it to you about the School of Athens. Very, very different, Northern Renaissance. I wanted to show you the whole painting because we are going to have a look in a different context at a German painting of the 20th century, and because it's important that you see, that you get familiar with the whole one. Also, we will focus more on the central part. So it is an altarpiece. I want to throw a few more terms at you. With an altarpiece, you can have different kind of things. You could have a diptych, which would be a little bit when you have altar pieces which are folded like that, like an open book. You could have a triptych where you have the central panel and then 2 wings, or a polyptych, which is more than 3. So this is a polyptych. The location is for the original location was the monastery of St. Anthony in Isenheim. And in this monastery, they had a hospital, and it was in a hospital chapel where that particular altarpiece was displayed. And the people who were treated there had an illness called St. Anthony's fire, which was a kind of gangrene. And it was extremely painful, and many of them died. And one of the ways of surviving, potential surviving this illness, was through amputation. So actually for the patients it was horrific, but it must have been extremely horrific for the monks as well. So that altarpiece has therefore several functions. It should give strength to the monks as an encouragement for that they are doing something good to heal, and that there will be redemption eventually and a resurrection. But it was also a way of giving comfort to the patients that Christ has suffered the way they have suffered, and He has suffered for them, so that they do not feel alone. Now, we have here the figure of St. Anthony that we've referred, that we actually really understand it in the context of the church and of the monastery. We have here depiction of Saint Sebastian. Then we have here in the central panel Christ on the cross with the inscription INRE, which is standing for Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Then we have here St. John the Baptist with the sacrificial lamb. And we have here Mary Magdalene, whom we recognize through her attribute of the ointment jar, and who is a symbol of penitence. And then we have here the Mother of Christ and St. John the Evangelist. So it's also interesting, baptism and renewal, the symbolism of the 2 figures within a painting. Just try to remember a little bit how Raphael's Madonna was depicted. Here it is a grieving mother. There is no idealization. The attention is primarily on the figure of Christ. Very important here is also date-wise, the painting is prefiguring for 2 years the beginning of the Reformation. So the context is here very important. In Northern Europe, in Germany, in this area, there would have been already maybe so the anticipation of what then through Martin Luther, the beginning of the Reformation started. Very different to for example, like in Italy. In these regions, first of all, the Bible would have been translated into the vernacular, so in the local language. And through that, people started reading the texts themselves. So it was not interpreted through a priest, or it would not have been only accessible in Latin and they would not have been able to understand it. So they would have been subject to the interpretation and intimidation of the church. No, they were able to read the texts themselves, which meant also artists started not having idealized settings, but they often referred directly to what happened. So when Christ died, we had the eclipse. So you have the darkening here. So this is something, that's why it makes it also so much more harrowing. The other thing is sort of how really, really direct everything is done. Look at the wooden cross. The beam, the horizontal beam, is weighed down because of the weight of Christ. The body of Christ is elongated because of the weight. I spare you close-up views, but it is absolutely literal. The way you really see the pain of these thick nails going through the body, the blood coming out, how actually the skin starts changing and gets bluish. You see also, because of the Passion of Christ, through on the way up to Golgotha, how the body has been abused. So you see all the marks. The loincloth, yeah, is not beautiful, elegant drapery. No, there are shreds there. You know, it's really dirty, everything. The agony here with the hands, with the fingers up. Absolutely, it goes really through flesh and bones. And I have to say, if you listen then to Bach cantatas, when you're looking at that, you really get a chill across your spine. Also, I told you that this is a polyptych, so you can theoretically fold these arms like that here, and then you can fold the thing again. But if you fold it centrally, it goes down to here. And where does it go down? So this is more or less just when Christ is about to be laid to rest in a tomb. And the fold here goes through below the knees. So can you remember the beginning when I told you that one way of maybe helping people to survive would have been through amputation? So it would have been something the people, the monks or the patients would have been able to understand in the context of the time. This is why I wanted to spend more time with the Isenheim Altarpiece, because Otto Dix took over the religious iconography but put it in a kind of historical context. So you have the polyptych form. I know it's not a religious painting, but it's really religious iconography. There are various ways of interpreting things. You could say here, soldiers upright, you know, where the ethos comes, the pride comes, we are going into the war. And then here you have the massacre of the war, and then here people stumbling more or less out from the war scene and trying to carry wounded people. And here there could be two different interpretations, because you have soldiers lying there. So it could be either soldiers lying there sleeping in the trenches, or they could be dead. A little bit like referring to the burial of Christ. So there's absolute this kind of, when you look here, for example, with the tree and then the branch here, and the shreds here of some clothing, and also from bodies and so on, it really reminds you of the cross in the previous painting. There are certain ways also how one can interpret it, is that this is the morning, the soldiers go into war, the battle is noon, so midday, and this is the evening when they come out, and then, so sleeping, or resurrection, or whatever, the whole cycle continues eternally and eternally and eternally and eternally. Otto Dix painted it much, much later. There are different reasons. First of all, he was himself at the front. So I think an artist who would not have witnessed all the atrocities himself would not be able to convey these things in such a harrowing way. So it's personal experience. It's also very interesting. He did it a year before Hitler ascended to power. Otto Dix was one of the artists who in 1937 was part of the degenerate artists. So he was in this kind of exhibition for which he was mocked amongst other fellows. He obviously was not able to paint it immediately after the wars. There must have been really a kind of process in him not to be able to face it immediately, and maybe was it part of the healing process? It's very difficult. When I personally see this painting, I often come to my mind is from Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front, the book as well. So it's something, if you want to investigate further, I would maybe read a little bit about the context of Remarque's work, and maybe even read, because it's not a long book, and then again revisit this painting. And you can see how important for Otto Dix Grunewald's piece was, and how a religious topic can have so many different interpretations and used for political or historical contexts. So I just, here you have a little bit of slide which brings you the elements again together, so that you can see a certain parallels, and also with the light playing here and the darkness here, and then the bodies laying here. There's a famous painting actually of the entombment of Christ, or Christ in the tomb, by Holbein, which is also a kind of horizontally rectangular work, so you might want to look this up. And I would like to conclude with this one here. Roscoe is an abstract expressionist artist, and he was asked for this new building of the chapel in Houston in Texas, to create 14, straight away it looks like black canvases. I just showed you only this kind of image because it would be otherwise too much. Before I look more closely at this one here, I would like to point out that the whole church is also in view of a Greek cross. A Greek cross is when you have 4 equal arms, different to the Latin cross, which is literally like a crucifix, and which is something you have, for example, St. Peter's Cathedral. The central part was originally a Greek cross, which was then extended. So a lot of the old churches have this Greek cross plan. So it was used in this very modern context. Why these black canvases? I think it is very open, and I do not want to speculate now on interpretations. What was important to the people who commissioned it was that it should be open to any faith. And maybe this is explaining why there is no kind of religious subject matter or attributes or iconography, that maybe anyone can go there, whether religious or non-religious, or regardless the denomination, and could find a place for contemplation, of peace, of calm. And it has a much more, maybe more contemporary approach to spirituality. Question. There was a few years ago an exhibition in the Tate Gallery in London, which was dedicated to Roscoe's work, and only this section was taken and was borrowed from the Houston Chapel. And I still remember the effect it had for me, because they literally wanted to create in an exhibition room this effect. And this very simple bench, and then one is there, and it was for me personally, and this is my personal interpretation, it's almost having had a look at Grunewald's crucifixion with the 3 main panels, so let's leave the bottom one out, almost emerging into Dix's painting, and from that into the void. It was for me so a kind of chronological development. In a certain way, this element of the Trinity is reiterated through it out, but I'm very much aware that this is a very personal approach to it. please do not think it's just black. Roscoe works, he paints in different kind of levels and paint upon layers of paint, and then you have always different tones shining through, and each one of them would have a slight different shade. So there's something very calm, very modern, very minimalist, but I think this is one of the things where you need to, nothing is telling you something, you have to let go, and this can be scary. Thank you.